would occur under legalization. So summing up, to me, from every conceivable perspective, from a moral or rights perspective, from a constitutional perspective, or from a consequentialist perspective, okay, we adults have the right to use drugs, okay, just as they have the right to do virtually anything else you can imagine, with a few very special exceptions, as Dr. Murray alluded to, killing other people, stealing other people's things, but beyond that, governments don't have the right to interfere in any of other human activities. Thank you.
All right, we have two very different points of view. And before I get into the questions that the students have written, I thought each of you might want to question the other for a few minutes.
All right.
And I will let you go first. You know, the rules of this part of the game are, you've heard what your opponent has to say, what's your response, and vice versa.
We've talked more than once.
I'm sure you have, but they haven't heard you.
I know, and I think that he has honed and sharpened. There are parts where I absolutely just disagree on the calculus. That is, cure worse than disease. That's an empirical question. We can add up the costs of the incarceration and damage to failed future, and then the public health, and so we can return to that in a second. But I am interested in this because it occurs to me, you said, look, it's the misuse of a product. That gets us in trouble, snowboard. And I would have to say, I think consistent with my posture, it seems to me it's the use of the product, and the magnitude of the damage may vary, but it happens over time. And it happens incrementally and worsens and worsens. And I've observed this, and it's a standard in the treatment world and in the psychiatric world, and the people who've ever dealt with a family member. It deepens and tolerance grows, and the damage gets more and more profound, and then it reveals itself. How damaging just regular use has been. As we've seen, 50% are dependent who are daily marijuana smokers. Well, daily marijuana, that's just kiddie dope. No, it's 70% potent now. And 50% of them get deeply addicted who are daily smokers. And what's happened to daily smokers is now 40% of kids. It's been huge. The damage to their brains, to the IQ, to the mental, the cognitive performance, it's there. They just weren't aware of it. College students who are smoking think, hey, I'm fine. Go on, I see everything that's there. It's like you're losing your eye. No, I see everything that's there. Whack! What the hell just hit me? Their brains are being affected in ways they don't anticipate. Add a few years, you will see. But okay, here's a story that's a tough one for me because it happened in my local neighborhood. And my daughter knows the kids. Teen gets 7 years in drug death, Virginia. Virginia teen sentenced to 7 years in prison Wednesday, wow, for providing a morphine pill to a classmate at a party. Among a handful of drugs that led to her death, David Evers, Centerville High School, pleaded guilty in September, giving the pill to 17-year-old Alexia Springer at a party. She was with partygoers who crushed and snorted the pill in the basement of Clifton home as the parents sat upstairs. Ooh. Springer took additional prescription pills and drank alcohol before going to sleep, failing to wake up the next day. Her death was ruled accidental. And she had been accepted to college for the incident. Springer was a homecoming princess and varsity runner. A couple lives ruined there. She's dead. Parents are upset. That would be externalities, I think. The parents suffering. And he's going to prison. But it was accidental. Yeah, but it turns out he's a dealer. He's been doing this for a long time. And somebody now died. If drug use were a right, how does this play out legally? She has a right to the drug. He has a right to give it to her. Parents, tough. What? Were they misusing the drugs? They were actually pharmaceutical products. Diverted. Used inappropriately. Well, yeah. But was this not a lifetime? This was one episode. People are collapsing with fentanyl overdoses from first-time use, found with needles in their arms. It's pretty much the use itself. So then I'll just continue this vein for a second, and then I'll give it back to you. Here are some things that I've been culling for anticipation of asking, not about the misuse, but just about the use. By the way, homicide toll in Chicago was 762 people in 2016. In Baltimore, OD deaths in the third quarter alone were 762. Apparently it's a crime. Among pregnant women, the prevalence of past month marijuana use has increased 62% in the last 10 years. Pregnant women using, and now we know the impact on the infant, on gestation, on the brain, the neural circuits, the low birth weight, the risk. That's just regular use, and it's producing an externality, I guess, not misuse. Or maybe special circumstances would be invoked. They shouldn't be using if they're pregnant. But what about the notion of it being a right? 57% of the increase in Maryland infants born exposed to opioids from 2006 to 2015. Marijuana, cocaine, alcohol, and opioids. Early development marijuana changing critical circuits in neurotransmitting receptors and so forth.
So would
Yeah.
it be your position that there is no such thing as what you might call safe use or non-harmful use? So
Understood.
from your point of view, any use is over the line.
Any use
and that's
is
why
risky.
you disagree.
It's a risk factor, and I will calculate it as well. I'll put one last thing on the table because it interests me in particular because we're now going in the wrong direction. It's veterans and suicidal ideation. Suicidal ideation in the country has gone up dramatically, 12% a year over the last 7 years. That's really strange, including episodes trying to fill. And vets who are using marijuana given to them as treatment for their PTSD are now experiencing great risk of suicidal ideation. They're taking it like they were recommended to take it. They're not misusing. So problematic. There's episodes where suicide and infant damage are the consequences of people taking without themselves necessarily going into deep dependency. So is any use risky? Yes, any use is risky. But in fact, we have brain imagery of casual college users whose hippocampus was changed by once a month or less frequently, but it was high potency, and they're relatively young. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody does. In fact, some people are very much more at risk. Maybe 10%, maybe more percent of the population is genetically predisposed to having serious reactions and responses, psychoses, as a result of exposure, genetic predisposition, comorbidity issues. They're very much at risk. But even someone who is normal is taking risks with regard to that. And notice that we would escalate or graduate the societal responses. No one gets thrown in prison for having marijuana, for using. Nobody's in prison for use. That's a myth. The incarceration story has been wildly oversold. People in federal prison are there because 98% of them are drug traffickers with serious weight who've done it multiple times with violence attached. 17% of people in state prison are users and dealers with multiple offenses and serious problems. The rest of people either get a fine or they go to drug court and they're told, better clean up your act, kid. Nowhere in the Western world is somebody seriously incarcerated for use of drugs. We escalate that. But when they begin to deal and when they begin to do damage to others, there's a serious problem, and it goes, we have a responsibility, I think.
Okay,
Done.
all right. Take it
Am I
away.
responding or asking my own question?
Well,
or
the way
just-
I had thought about this was that you would have an opportunity to respond to what you heard, and you would do the same. But let's just
okay.
give you 5 minutes to do what you want.
Do what you want.
And then I'll
Let
come to-
me respond to a few of the things that Dr. Murray raised. So first, I think that it's extraordinarily important for people to think about the question of whether addiction is equivalent to misuse. I'm willing to bet that, 50, 70% of the people in this room are addicted to caffeine. Nobody cares. What's the cost of that addiction? Well, it's not zero. You spend $15 a day on decaf, double soy latte, whatever is at Starbucks. There's some cost. But nobody thinks of addiction per se as being bad. Indeed, some addictions are quite good because one's addiction to exercise maybe keep one's healthy. One's addiction to healthy foods maybe is good for one's longer-term health. Addiction is potentially bad if there's some clear negative side effect beyond the direct effects that people are looking for, that you get from long-term use by being addicted, such as lung cancer from tobacco, cirrhosis of the liver from some kinds of alcohol consumption. I defy anyone to point out similar, clear, life-threatening or major health effects from long-term use of opioids, of marijuana, of cocaine, and so on. So when we say there's a risk that people might get addicted, the correct answer should be, so what? It just should not be an issue. It should not be regarded as one of the costs of using drugs. In thinking about the fact that there are clearly negative experiences that people have with drugs, it's important to look at the whole range of data. If you only look at people who are in drug abuse treatment centers, you're going to get the same biased impression of what happens from using drugs as if you only thought that you thought that skiing or playing athletics, okay, you drew those conclusions by only look at people who are having their knees rehabbed or their knees scoped. Okay? But zillions of people exercise tons, and it's beneficial or at least pleasant, okay, or not seriously deleterious, and never need to get their knees scoped for whatever, because their meniscus is torn or whatever. So you have to look at the whole distribution. Dr. Murray doesn't want to accept it, but there are zillions of people around the world who are using drugs regularly who don't end up in treatment, who don't end up incarcerated, who don't end up with any of the negatives that some people end up with. And I think he's de-emphasizing the fact that people have these sorts of issues with zillions of other legal commodities. Alcohol is probably the most obvious, the one that's closest in its properties. Of course, some people do get addicted to alcohol, but function for their whole lives, even though they'd be really unhappy come 6 in the evening if they didn't have access to their glass of Bordeaux or their martini or whatever. And some people, of course, get addicted to alcohol in a way which is truly harmful. I think talking about the fact that drugs are risky, again, is so incredibly incomplete because billions of things are risky. It was risky that I drove here on the Mass Pike. Okay? But that doesn't mean that I don't have the right to do it. It doesn't mean that we should have a law prohibiting it. Okay? So we should be thinking objectively about drugs in a consistent way, not thinking that they are magically different, that they're magnificently different, that they're somehow this completely different creature than zillions of other commodities that we think people have the right to do and that we keep as legal in our society. I'll stop there for now.
Okay, let me see if I can split the difference here and see whether I can get you two, either of you, to agree to this proposition. It seems to me that the difference between you comes down to an empirical question about whether or not use of any kind leads to addiction, and we might agree that addiction of certain kinds anyway, has deleterious consequences, and we might want to see a role, some sort of social role, in addressing harmful addiction. From your point of view, any use is a slippery slope to very negative consequences, including addiction. And from your point of view, there are lots of people using all kinds of substances that never get to that point, and you don't have a problem with that, but you might have a problem with addiction. You might have a problem with addiction if it caused harm to others in particular, if children were neglected because they had addicted parents, or fetuses were exposed because they had addicted mothers when they were pregnant. And it sounds to me as though if you could be convinced that not all uses lead to addiction, you don't have as much of a problem with what we might call casual use. You just don't believe it's possible to eliminate the probability of addiction, a high probability of addiction. To me, this comes down to an empirical question about whether or not that's really the case. And my presumption is that you're arguing there's a lot of evidence that that's not the case, that in fact, lots of use doesn't turn into addiction at all, and so we don't need to regulate use, but we might need to regulate harmful use or addictive use. And you would argue that if we don't step in and regulate from the very get-go, we are vastly increasing the probability of exactly that kind of addiction. Is that a fair compromise, if you will, between the two of you? Because if it comes down to the empirical question about how likely is addiction to emerge out of casual use, that's less of a philosophical question in my mind than it is an empirical question. Let me ask you both to respond to that perspective.
Basically accept your description. I wouldn't quite use the word I'm worried about addiction. I'd say I'm worried about harmful use, externality generating use. And I'm worried about the fact that attempts to reduce that harmful use have all sorts of unintended negative consequences.
I hear you.
Two pieces to my
So let me ask you then to begin with, if you were to imagine a social interest in controlling the extreme and harmful use, what would that look like? Would that be behavioral tests where someone's over that line and that's when the state would step in, but not before that?
That's probably a reasonable approximation, but I would say it would look roughly like the way we treat alcohol. We treat driving under the influence as a crime or certainly an infraction. We would treat a parent who was engaged in child neglect, whether or not that parent was drinking, but certainly it might be an exacerbating factor. But simply rotting one's own liver, we would not regard as a basis for intervention.
So why don't you
Yeah.
tell us what's wrong with that point of view?
No, I thought your framing of it was fair, and it certainly is an empirical question, and it's not just from hanging out in treatment centers or exercising a focus on the most damaging. My sense as to why the risk is greater than we've anticipated is science has progressed considerably, and the analysis, discovery, and observation of this phenomenon. I've worked with National Institute of Drug Abuse, Nora Volkoff, been in the White House on this for 13 years. Science moved dramatically. At the same time, the potency and the drug itself changed. At the same time, the patterns of use have begun to change, with younger and younger polydrug use amongst kids of ages 12, 13, 14, when brain is developmentally formative. So for some people, the use is catastrophic.
So you might
even
restrict
relatively.
use if you were talking about children whose development would be affected, but you might
More
have
intensely.
a less harsh view or categorical view if you were talking about,
I talked about graduated
adults.
scales to some degree, but hold on. It's also because we've learned that there's a process here. And the process is an inevitable biologic process in the neurophysiology of the brain. The drug counterfeits the reward structure of the brain and provides a phony, lying stimulus that appears to be something that it isn't. And over time, tolerance grows. And because of tolerance, the person requires larger doses to maintain the desirable state. And the brain gets hijacked into a cycle of intensification over time. For those most vulnerable, and it could, let's say 10%, I think it's higher, but it could be 10%, it's growing, we have a responsibility, even if it's only 10%, that it'll be catastrophic because you don't know when you pull the Russian roulette trigger, if it's you.
So for the
some use
n-
is terrible,
for the
but all
90%
use does this. It gradually inclines you incrementally towards a state of dependency, which is servitude.
except that we know, I mean, unless you object to this empirical characterization,
Yeah.
that there are millions of people who drink alcohol.
Yeah.
There, and a tiny fraction, a very perhaps damaged fraction, are alcoholics. But you wouldn't argue, would you, that there is an inevitable downhill characteristic of anyone who picks up a drink, that they're going to end up alcoholic? You would say there's a certain proportion,
Right.
perhaps a tiny proportion, who would be somehow predestined to that level of disintegration. But the vast majority of users of alcohol are not in that danger zone. Or are you arguing empirically that the science is telling us that's not the case?
No, I think the alcohol user is at risk, and I take it two ways. Number one, yeah, alcohol is a problem for society, and it is probably qualitatively different than what the drug impact is, and that could be argued, and it demonstrates itself. Each one of them presents different risk profiles. Alcohol can be acute and kill you from overdrinking. Alcohol usually shows up later in life. Marijuana, for instance, is contrasted with alcohol as being benign. It's not. It has incredible effects early on, particularly developmentally, that aren't perceived as such, but doesn't lead to acute overdose. Okay, different profiles. Can we add as a society the second one to the first one and think we're better off? I would say no. Drugs added to alcohol. We've got enough of a problem with alcohol. Alcohol may be qualitatively different, but at the same time, there are about 120 million current alcohol users in America because it's not prohibited except to the underage. That is the prevalence burden of disease of that drug on American life.
And would
If we were to
you argue
magnify-
for restriction of
Legal drugs
access to alcohol?
are at the level of 1 million heroin users, 3 million cocaine users. If you took off all legal restrictions and you incentivized, or you made them all right, what if we had a scale of magnitude for a public health disease burden of 120 million users? It is a problem, but the presence of the law against the drugs has served to at least constrain the prevalence outbreak. That's a public health good, I would say.
Any response to that before I get into some other questions?
No, I think we should let the.
All right, so I think there are some empirical questions underlying this dispute, if you will, that has to do with whether or not exposure or casual use leads to the sorts of debilitating addictions that we might all agree are problematic for society. Let's now talk about the social intervention process, or the sort of ability or appropriateness of state intervention. So you've written a book about prohibition. I'm sure you're very familiar with the literature on prohibition. We learned from the prohibition experience that it led to vast increase in in criminal markets because there was a pretty constant desire for the product, and organized crime found a way to supply it. How should we think about the efficacy or wisdom of forms of prohibition when we know from past experience that, at least from the historical point of view, there were all kinds of negative effects to prohibition itself that went well beyond users of any particular drug or alcohol? You may want to lead us off because you're the authority here on prohibition. What do we learn from your work on this?
Well, my view would be that we saw from alcohol prohibition what we've seen from other prohibitions of various substances across a lot of societies in history, that you create black markets, that black markets have more criminal activity because the participants cannot resolve their disputes with lawyers and courts and government agencies, so they resolve disputes with guns, so prohibition increases violence. You get corruption because you can't influence public policy as easily through a legislative or a lobbying or whatever process, so there's more incentive to bribe officials, bribe judges, bribe jurors. In some cases, if the goods happen to come from some other country, and you force prohibition on those countries, such as Peru, Colombia, Afghanistan, you generate more violence and corruption in those countries. Infringements on civil liberties are...
No, I'm sorry. I'm with you.
It's a sensitive microphone.
You're doing a good job.
Infringements on civil liberties are extreme. So all the things I discussed before are just inevitable effects of outlawing anything for which there is a substantial demand. If we outlawed, clam chowder ice cream, we probably wouldn't see a big black market in clam chowder ice cream. If we outlawed Ben & Jerry's vanilla, we wouldn't see a black market. People would just buy Haagen-Dazs vanilla. But if you outlaw something for which there's a substantial demand, you get the black markets and all those negative effects.
What do you think about that?
It's smart. It follows a standard line about prohibition that would produce Al Capone, which is not true. They were there beforehand. They went into alcohol, absolutely, but there were smuggling operations and criminal gangs and mafias moving everything from human trafficking, which they still are, cigarettes. In New Jersey, they moved trash. It's part of a big-time violent coercive operation. Trash. Yeah. The criminal dimension, thank you, I've got my water here, is present.
So you don't think there was any linkage between prohibition and
It intensified because of
emergence
the
or-
wide engagement with alcohol. There were lots of public health benefits, too, as we all know from the rates and so forth. But I'm not arguing on behalf of prohibition. What I'm going to say is something kind of different. I don't think that it quite gets this across. What's the alternative exactly? Well, we would have legal, okay, we could do the cost benefit about whether that really is better or worse than prohibition, but hold on a second. You haven't really left prohibition now, have you? Because I've already heard someone say, but not for kids. For kids, obviously. Oh, it would be prohibited for kids to get drugs. Well, yeah. And not for pregnant. Okay, but prohibited. And what if they wanted more than they were supposed to? They go back down to the store.